The chair, to eternal credit, did a really good job of then getting around everybody, spending time with them, making them feel comfortable. And we got things back on track. And then in what turned out to be one of the most rapid turnarounds I've ever seen, she hired a guy who had worked for her previously to come in as CEO. And we ended up selling the business 6 months later for twice the offer that we'd previously entertained. So all ended up very happy in the end.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs who face the critical decision: should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny Shadchnev. As a founder coach and author specializing in CEO succession, I interview founders, chief executives, and investors who share their stories of navigating this transition. Today, I'm speaking with Nic Brisbourne, partner at Molten Ventures. Nic and I have known each other for over 10 years, and this is because Nic has been a board member and lead investor at Makers, the company I founded back in 2013. So when I stepped down as a chief executive in 2020, it was Nic with whom I discussed, negotiated, and orchestrated my own CEO succession. In the previous episode, last week, I spoke with Claudia Harris, the scale-up CEO who replaced me as a founder CEO. And in this conversation, we will continue exploring the same CEO transition, but now from his angle as the venture capitalist. Enjoy the conversation. Hello, Nic. Great to have you on this podcast. How are you doing today?
Very nice to be here, Evgeny, and I'm doing well, thank you. And you?
Yeah. And me too. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today because we've got so much to discuss. Your overall experience as an investor with various aspects of CEO succession in startups, but also our story, because you've been on the board of Makers for the last about 10 years or so, and you played a significant role in my own CEO succession when I stepped down, and Claudia was appointed as the new CEO of Makers. So, Nic, let's start with a fascinating story that we discussed just before we hit the recording. You took part in a really interesting CEO succession scenario about 15 years ago or so. Would you like to share it?
Yes. And so it was a software company based up in Cambridge, and we had this situation where the product was really strong. Customers really loved the product. We weren't quite getting the growth that we thought was possible from the company for a few reasons. And after trying a few things, ultimately came to the conclusion that the right thing to do for the business was to change the CEO. And that's not a decision that we ever come to lightly, or advise anyone to come to lightly. It's, I mean, as well as all of the obvious kind of personal upheaval that it brings, whenever you hire a new chief exec into a company, you've got a chance of it working and a chance of it not working. If you're a really good recruiter, maybe the chances of it working are like 50 to 60%, so it's like, it's a big lever to pull. It can have a big impact. It's very easy to end up in a worse situation. And I've certainly been there. So with this company up in Cambridge, unfortunately, the CEO is actually quite a good friend of mine, and he'd made it very clear that I just wasn't able to get into a conversation with him about performance or tee this up. And so he actually started to become aware that I'd lost faith in him. He could tell that from the questions I was asking at the board, and the relationship deteriorated. And so, there's a lot of things that we can learn here about how I can maybe have done things better then, and how I try to do them better now. But this kind of situation kind of persisted for a little bit, and I spent some time getting the other stakeholders on board with the change, and eventually we decided that we were collectively ready to make a change. And the CEO, though, had got wind of it, or maybe just kind of read the runes. And about 3 days before we were going to pull the trigger, we get a call from one of the other senior execs saying, the whole management team have lost faith in the chair, and either she goes or we all go. So a real kind of ultimatum. And our plan had been for the chair to step in as interim CEO. So kind of she was critical to the whole picture. And so we're like, as investors, sort of crotty, what do we do now? And there's a scary moment, but really you've only got one choice, and you've got to stick with your plan. If you let yourself be victim to blackmail in that sense, it's only ever going to end badly, isn't it? I think. So we organised a meeting. We asked everyone to come down to London, and we had the CEO in one room. We had the whole management team in the other, and we sat with the CEO and explained the situation. And he was actually very gracious, to be fair to him. And then we went into the room with the management team, and they were just looking at me and like literally didn't know which way it was going to go, and obviously pretty worried about their own positions in all of this. And one of the difficult things about this for them is that the departing CEO had told all of them that the chair thought that they were useless, that she would likely, if she was to take over, she would likely fire them, and so they were all quite worried when I said that we've asked the CEO to step down, and the chair will be taking over as interim CEO whilst we hire a new one. So jaws dropped, hit the table around the boardroom that we were in, and everyone shuffled out quietly. And I was quite worried, like, 'cause this was actually it was a promising business. I thought if we could just get things going right. And the chair, to eternal credit, did a really good job of then getting around everybody, and over kind of a period of 2 or 3 weeks, she was in the company every day, spending time with them, making them feel comfortable. Um, and we got things back on track, um, and then in what turned out to be one of the most rapid turnarounds I've ever seen, she hired a guy who had worked for her previously to come in as CEO, and we ended up selling the business 6 months later for what was twice the offer that we'd previously entertained. So kind of all ended up very happy in the end, but a real kind of scary moment in the middle. And why did it end up scary? To a lot of the points in your book, Evgeny, we had a real failure of communication. Ultimately, is what we ended up with, where we did.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about this story is that it involves the senior team trying to play an active role. Whereas usually in most cases, I think it's between the founder or founders and the investors trying to negotiate the situation. But in this case, the senior team tried to influence the outcome.
Yes, they did. And I think, so you're right. Normally the CEO founders, wants to deal with this with a smaller group as possible, so it doesn't destabilize the rest of the company. And that is, I think, far and away the best way to handle things. It didn't play out that way. And well, the CEO knew that he was vulnerable, and tried to recruit the management team to save him. And he solicited their support on the basis of false information, and was quite disingenuous about the whole thing. But yeah, he was trying to use them effectively.
Yeah. It's a shame that such things happen, but at the same time, I imagine when a lot of money and a lot of power is at stake, people fight using all available means.
Yeah, and and he really wanted to continue to be CEO of the business. There was
Yeah.
a lot of ego at play, I think,
Yeah.
as much as anything.
Yeah. And today, with the benefit of experience, you've been in a venture game for at least 25 years, as far as I remember.
Yeah.
What's your thinking about the wisdom of trying to force the CEO out? I'm sure it's appropriate in some cases and less appropriate in others. How do you think about it?
Uh, so the first thing to say is that it's the best thing is to try and avoid CEO transitions in the first place. And I started my career in venture when I was 25, when I got my first job in venture. And after doing a little kind of couple of years of carrying bags for people, the next stage was I got put on the boards of some underperforming companies, and ended up working on a few CEO transitions, including, well, there was actually 3 CEO transitions of that company that I was just describing. That was the final one. That's where I learned it's a difficult and risky business. It's difficult. It always takes a long time to build consensus amongst stakeholders. And then when you make the hire, that then takes a bit more time, which is lost. And then you don't always get it right. So the first thing is to try and, as an investor, to try and get involved with companies where you're not going to need to transition the CEO. But yes, sometimes, you do a great job of backing a great entrepreneur in a great company, and people are good for one phase. And this is, I think, probably the situation at Makers. People are really well suited for one phase of a company, but not so much for a later phase. It's very different starting something, running something with 10 to say 30, 40 people. And then it's different again as the business gets bigger than that. If the business is not performing to its potential, then you have to ask why. And if the reason is that it's execution at the CEO level, then you need to start thinking about a change. I mean, it's pretty simple and obvious as I say it, but I don't think it's more complicated than that in the end.
Yeah. And you mentioned that even if the company does a good job looking for a candidate, the chances of success are still somewhere around maybe a 50-60%. What makes
Yes,
it so challenging to find a new leader for a start?
that's a good question. I've not asked myself, why is it so challenging? So you haven't got a 100% hit rate with any hire. So I don't know what your hit rate is, but it's, you know, I mean, if you've
Lower.
got 80%, you're probably doing really well, right? And so 60, so you're not the numbers I'm giving are maybe not too far off hit rate for, success rates for hires generally. And then I think coming in, to take over as CEO of a young company is, particularly if it's a founder replacement, is a particularly difficult gig. You're not dropping into a bunch of structure where you can rely on everybody else for a little bit whilst you figure things out. Instead, typically, the reason that you're coming in is that things haven't been going quite as well as everybody thinks they can. By definition, therefore, stuff needs change. And as an incoming CEO, it's not always possible to really get it's not possible to really get your hands around what needs to change until you're properly inside the business. And from the perspective of the board director, investors, you can have a view on what you think the issues are and what therefore what you're looking for in a candidate to come and fix things, but be one step removed. And so I guess it's just kind of inaccuracies in that view, the risk. And there aren't always amazing candidates around, depending on the kind of quality of the business, location, how much money you've got in the bank, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And I imagine the further ahead the business is, the stronger the product market fit, the stronger the position of the company, the easier it is to find the right kind of leader.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, like I think it's almost impossible to, it's quite a big word, but it's not far, almost impossible to hire a great CEO into a business that's 10, 20 people, turning over, I don't know, sub a million, because at that stage, and there are always going to be exceptions, right? But most businesses at that stage look very flaky to most people who look at them. Turnover is tiny, customers haven't been there that long, products immature, teams small. And so to incoming candidates, the whole thing looks very risky. If you're in a venture-backed situation, there isn't that much equity that you can put on the table. It's not that much cash in the business either. And so it's just hard to put together.
Yeah.
So it looks very risky to the candidate. The packages are not huge. And so, you end up typically in those situations saying, okay, I'll work with someone a little bit earlier in their career, and taking a chance on some raw talent. As business gets more mature, an incoming CEO can see that everything is working, and it's more about kind of management than real kind of vision or entrepreneurial flair is required. Then there's many more candidates that are A qualified and B up for doing that task. And then and you've got more money to pay typically as well.
Yeah. And there is an interesting point here because I find that first-time founders at an early stage of the business, basically pre-Series A, sometimes worry that if the business is not doing particularly well, then the board might force the founder CEO out. Whereas from your perspective as an investor, it's an incredibly risky thing to do. And if the situation is going to be solved, it's probably going to be solved by the founding team because they are impossible to replace at this stage.
Yeah. Yes. Very much so. It's changing the CEO is a last resort, and oftentimes you look and go, it's not even worth thinking about.
And do you find that things are materially different at a later stage? Series B and Series C, or maybe private equity investors who might come in with a desire to invest and an idea of who should be the new CEO, basically their own candidate, not because their previous CEO did anything wrong, but just because it's their preference.
Yeah, so as the business gets more mature, as I was describing earlier, then making a change becomes less risky. And at the point of new investment, then from a new investor perspective, if they've got someone who they know and trust, and can see that, or in their view, that there's a significant step up in capability that will come with that, then it can be a real way of de-risking an investment. We did a later stage deal which looked like that. We were talking to them for a bit and really liked the market, but came to the conclusion that the CEO had done a great job to get the business to where it was, turning over, I want to say turnover was about 8 million or something. But wasn't, felt too risky to back it with him at the next stage. And so we ended up having a conversation with him saying, listen, he'd love to do this deal. He was getting significant cash out as well. And he'd always been very clear. He didn't want to get packaged on for another exit. So look, we need to we need to start hiring for this new person now, and need to get a feel for the quality of candidate we can get and see that you're already up for it before we make this deal. And so he agreed with that. We started the recruitment process prior to the deal closing even.
So effectively, you offer to invest, but on the condition that the company will start looking for a new chief executive.
Exactly. And by the time we closed the deal, we'd already started the process, and I was able to see that the founding CEO was indeed genuinely up for it. And we were able to get some good candidates, and the early signs that the chemistry were okay. We really wanted the founder to stay in the business as well.
Yeah. And how often does the opposite happen? When a founder is trying to raise the investment and they're open at the fundraising stage, that they believe in the company, but they might not be the best person for the next stage of the journey. And so they would like to have a conversation about the CEO succession before you commit to the investment.
Very rarely. I think you touch on this in the book, don't you?
Mhm.
It's one of the difficulties for founders, founding CEOs, or CEO at any stage actually, when they start to think that maybe they don't want to be CEO going forward for whatever reason, is that as soon as they have that conversation, then with potential investors, then the risk profile of the investment changes, right? All of a sudden it's not, okay, let me assess this team. It's, and the product and the market. It's, let me assess the team, the product and the market, and the additional risk that we run a recruitment process and then we make some change and then that does or doesn't work. I mean, 9 times out of 10, if someone was, we were talking to a company, particularly at the early stages where it's so much about the founder. And at some point during the discussions, the founder said, oh, by the way, I need to be leaving this company in the next 12 months or something. Then, I mean, literally hasn't happened, but I think that would put us off 9 times out of 10. We'd say like you need to get a transition made and then we'll talk again, unless there was something
Yeah.
magical about the business,
Yeah.
Later
And
stage, different perhaps.
yeah, later stage is different. But this raises the question of the timing of the transition. Because as you've just explained, stepping down just before a fundraising event is difficult. And I imagine it's equally difficult to step down right after the event. So it sounds like the best way to orchestrate the transition is effectively in between 2 rounds when the company has already made some progress, but there is still enough money in the bank until it's got to close the next.
Yes, because it's also quite difficult to attract a high quality new CEO if there's not much money in the bank. When you've just raised money from someone and you haven't told them that you're thinking about leaving, it's maybe not the done thing to turn around and leave straight away. But give a little period and then have the difficult conversation. But I think in that scenario, better to be having the conversation earlier, sooner after the fundraise has closed, than leave it longer and have the situation where there's less cash in the bank and making it even harder to find a good replacement.
Yeah. Because the more room for maneuver the company has, the easier it will be to find the right person.
Yep.
Yeah. And Nick, let's make a transition to our own story of our own CEO succession. You were on the board of Makers since pretty much the very beginning. I think the company was founded in 2013 and you joined in 2014, if not late 2013. So very, very early on. And then we changed the CEO in 2020 when I stood down and Claudia Harris was appointed as the new chief executive, and she's been running the company ever since. Shall I share my own recollection of how we approached it? And then I would love to hear your perspective of how you recall this process as an investor.
Perfect. You go first, Evgeny.
Yeah. So my recollection is that in around 2017, 2018, I started thinking for the first time that maybe at some point I would need to try to make a transition to another CEO, but that was years before it actually happened. And as I discussed on the podcast with Claudia, when we discussed our own transition, we recall discussing it in the very first conversation after she was appointed as a chair in 2017. Not as an intention to do anything straight away, but just as my concern, because I just try to be as open as possible early on. But then nothing really happened until 2019, when I saw fairly clearly that on the one hand, I was not enjoying running the company anymore. And at the same time, the company really needed a different CEO, a CEO with a different skill set going forward for the next stage of growth, because we shifted our attention to the enterprise market, and that just required a different skill set from the chief executive. And then at some point in 2019, I remember Claudia, you and I, we met for dinner and had a exploratory conversation about what this transition could look like. And yet it took us another year or so to actually orchestrate the transition, because it took time to align on the job specification, who we were looking for, how we're going to run the process. Then Claudia, of course, said that she would like to be considered, which changed the conversation because she was a chair at that point. But ultimately with the COVID lockdown happening in the middle of the process, we completed the CEO transition by September 2020. And so I remember that you and I had an informal conversation at some point in 2019. Then we were designing the job spec together. Then when Claudia said that she would like to be considered, we discussed how we should approach running the process, whether we should look for other external candidates to put her as a candidate in the wider context, and ultimately making a formal decision at the board level to make her an offer as a CEO, which was accepted. So that's my recollection of key events from 2019 to 2020. How do you remember it?
Yes, yeah, I think that you're much better on the precise dates on the years than me, but yeah, that all matches in terms of the sequence. And to draw kind of one thing out from that, what was one of the remarkable things about the way we did it, which I think is part of why it, so it's a transition that's worked out very well, hasn't it? I think for you personally and for the company. And so I'm very pleased we achieved that, obviously. But it was the communication was very open from the beginning, and the process was, we ran it at a pace which was consistent with everybody feeling comfortable with the pace at which things were moving, right? And so it was kind of very consensual on all sides at all points, and I think that's kind of one of the reasons the handover from you to Claudia worked so well, and that the business has succeeded since.
And I remember there was a moment when at some point we had a dinner at, I think, the restaurant at the Ace Hotel, probably around November or December 2019, if my memory serves me well, when you asked me how my transition thinking is going. And I remember that was the moment when I felt like it was not just a question, but more of a suggestion along the lines of, Evgeny, if you are thinking about doing it, then let's go and do it, because we've been talking about it for a few months. Do you remember that the dinner?
Yes, I do remember the dinner. And you're right. So I was consciously trying to give you a nudge, basically.
Yeah.
And then it's a nudge that we need to kind of go one way or the other. Uh, um, but I do recall feeling that we'd kind of, and this is a bit of a character fault of mine at times. I get tired of talk and want to move to action fast, sometimes too fast. But anyway, that was a bit the kind of the mental chatter that I'd been having
Mhm.
before, and so I thought, okay, let's just give a nudge and see where it starts to move.
And I think with the benefit of hindsight, it also worked out really well, because back then we didn't know that the lockdown or COVID would hit in a few months, and then the country would go into the lockdown. And I think we were very lucky that we started this process and actually made quite a lot of progress before the situation materially changed, because when we started orchestrating the CEO change, we were really optimistic about where the business was going. And when the pandemic hit and the entire country stopped hiring developers and much of our revenue disappeared overnight, suddenly it became really scary. At some point, I didn't know if we would have the business by the end of 2020.
Yes, yeah, exactly. If we're, yeah, it would have felt very different having those conversations in, I don't know, May, June 2020, wouldn't it? We would have probably actually said that this is not a time to be thinking about a transition. This is a time to be thinking about making sure we save the business.
Yeah, we would definitely be in a survival mode back then.
Yeah.
And Nick, you said that this CEO succession worked out really well, both for the business uh, and well, for me as a founder. In your experience, or from your perspective as an investor, what were the reasons, the conditions that enabled this transition to go as well as it did?
So we have still a very strong underlying business. That's really important. And, and you don't always have that. Sometimes, execution, business performance isn't at the level of expectations. And then you change we get a new CEO and things don't improve. And it turns out that, well, either the new CEO didn't have the capabilities that we hoped for, or maybe things were more broken than realized. There was one where we felt that, hired a new CEO, they didn't work out, so put the founder back in charge again, and he actually did a good job then and got the business to an okay exit. The conclusion we came to in that case was that really it wasn't the CEO's issue so much as so the issue we had in that company was that customers all really wanted their product, but it was nobody's top priority. And so driving sales with the velocity that we needed to was just really hard, and doesn't matter how good the CEO is you're not going to change that, really. Anyway, so strong underlying business really helped us. And second, we ran a really well, we just had a strong relationship. We had our dinners at the Ace Hotel and elsewhere, and we kept the dialogue going. And it wasn't always super easy, was it? But,
Yeah.
we both showed up for it, brought our best selves
Mhm.
every time. And so we figured a good way through. Third, I think, having Claudia as, there's probably two important things here. So, first, maybe the less obvious one. So she was chair. She was trusted. She was trusted by both of us. She was someone that we were both able to have conversations with, and you were able to have a more open conversation with her than you were with me. I was able to have a more open conversation with her than I was with you, and so she kind of brokered things a little bit. Your very first conversation was with her. I didn't learn about that for some time, and which is, I think, I imagine the way you wanted it. It's fine. And so having her as a conduit, a trusted third party on the board as a conduit, I think was helpful. And then finally, obviously having her there as a candidate made a big difference in the end.
Yes, and I would love to add a couple of points here. You are absolutely right that we had a good trusted relationship at that point. And I think that was in large part thanks to us navigating maybe more difficult moments in the year prior, because we built this relationship over time. By that point, we had been working together for about six, 6 or 7 years. So we knew each other, and we've seen various easy and not so easy situations in the prior years.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. We had a level of trust.
Yeah. And also, speaking of Claudia being a conduit and helping everyone to navigate this situation was, in my recollection, exactly the reason why we started looking for a chair 2 years prior. Because I think it was after, I don't, I don't remember the details, but I remember we had some kind of a difficult situation. And at some point, both of us sat down and said, look, if we had a chair at the board, the entire board would probably function in a better way. And that's when we started looking for a chair, and eventually, having interviewed several people, we appointed Claudia, and it sounds like it worked out exactly as intended. It helped us
Yeah.
to have a better conversation.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly right. And so the bringing a chairperson in when the business gets to a certain scale is it's a well trodden path for a lot of startups, and think with good reason. It's as things get more complicated, particularly as you start to get more investors. So we got a second investor. Edge Capital joined after Claudia was chaired, I believe. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Uh,
Yep.
um, but as things get more complicated, particularly as you get more investors, then having a chair on the board who can be that conduit and who can take some of the load off of the CEO of managing investors, I think can be a powerful driver of growth.
Yep. And how would you like the conversation about CEO succession to happen in the perfect world? If it needs to happen, whether it's initiated by the founders or the investors, what's the best approach?
So what is uh, from my perspective, what is best is if the founder CEO initiates the conversation, does so at a point sufficiently far in advance of us actually, like early basically, so that things are not already desperate by the time conversation has started. And that gives us time. It gives us time to say, like, thank you for raising this. I'm not quite sure you're right. Like, can we kind of think about how we can make this work for you or change whatever we need to change? So you enable that conversation, or if everyone's in agreement, then you've got time to plan things and do it properly. And time is a luxury you don't often get actually in startups, isn't it? But when you have time to plan a transition, then you're just much more likely to get a better result.
Yeah. And some founders are hesitant to open up this conversation with the board in the first place because it may feel like once they open the conversation, it will not be possible to close it. It feels like a one-way door. How do you think about how founders should balance being open with the board or the investors about their position versus a one-way door?
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? And it can be really scary for investors. If a founder CEO turns around and says it doesn't think they're right, then they're suddenly thinking, wow, well, that was a surprise for me. Maybe I didn't know my investment as well as I thought I did. Maybe that won't reflect well on me, my partnership. Maybe it's going to make it hard for this business to raise money at the next round. There's a risk that it evokes a negative response, a negative reaction. And so I think as a founder, you do need to be careful with that. And so the first thing is to try to build trusted relationships with your investors so that you kind of got a sense of what they're like, they know you, and then you can have conversations not about that you want to leave, but there are some challenges that you have maybe, or there's some things that are causing difficulties for you at home or whatever your reasons might be for what, and so they're kind of aware that there are some issues and then when you come to have a conversation about actually maybe we should think about a change here. It's not a complete surprise. So A, it's not a surprise, and B, you've got time. Then obviously it's not as good as if the the founder CEO is the right person, wants to stay the course, but it's managed. So that's one path. And then the other is, as we did at Makers, as you did with Claudia, is to get someone else on the board who you can trust, and then you can have the conversation with them and together think through how to manage it with investors.
And I imagine the same challenge arises on the investor side, because before you get to the point when you want to ask this founder CEO to, or the CEO to leave the business, you need to have prior conversations with them about things maybe not going well without drawing the conclusion that the CEO has to change, but at the same time, be clear enough that something needs to change. So how do you think about balancing it on the investor side?
Yeah, so it's difficult for investors too. So the thing that you're worried about as an investor is, you have a difficult conversation with the founder, they disagree, and you're at war with them. Relationship deteriorates, you lose kind of any influence that you might have had. Company investment performance starts to suffer, and you're just in a difficult situation that some CEOs do react negatively. If you look at the characteristics of good entrepreneurs, they're like this, like unwavering belief in themselves and their opportunity. And it's why they started it when, it was just a crazy idea and no one else really thought it had anything to it. And they stuck with it and they got some proof points and now they raised money. And so they've got this kind of dogged self-belief often, which is a real strength. And one of the things, I might have said this to you at some point, actually, one of the things I often think is one of the most difficult for CEOs is, as the company grows, then that kind of like, I'm going to stick, I trust myself, I'm going to stick the course, and I'm not going to listen to much outside influence. As the company scales, then you slowly need to be listening to more and more. You're doing more and more things that have been done before, so you don't need to figure it all out for yourself. Stopping listening and starting listening in small increments that's not an easy thing. Anyway, so there's hazard from the investor, because having the conversation in the wrong way can cause a breakdown in the relationship. And so again, it's the same answers, right? You want to try and build trust with your founders, spend time with them, ask them how they're doing personally, ask them how they feel their company is doing. Some CEOs are up for performance conversations with investors, some not, in my opinion. And I don't think it's, I wouldn't go forcing those if they're not, but they are, then that obviously opens things up. And then the next is to get a chair or other trusted third party on the board and use that as a way of breaking conversations.
And I imagine there is also a legal dimension here, because if you start a conversation with the CEO in your capacity as a board member, it might be seen as a start of the performance management process. And managing a CEO out on performance grounds can be really difficult and can take a lot of time. So my understanding is that you don't want to make a formal performance management process out of it, and ideally find a mutual agreement.
Yeah. Yes. So I don't think I've ever, I haven't ever been in a situation where we put a CEO on a formal, PIP, performance improvement program. Think the better way to handle it by far is to try and have adult, mature conversations and then reach a settlement agreement where there's, an appropriately generous package, and the CEO steps aside and signs away any future claims against the company. So that is the better way to tie it up rather than doing anything too formal. And so if you're comfortable that you can go down that route, then you can have the only conversations with less risk. I mean, you can't start saying, well, you don't even have the right as an individual board director to be making employment decisions, firing anybody. So you shouldn't go anywhere near that, obviously, but you can have reasonably open conversations.
Yeah. But again, it goes down to the importance of trust is the foundation for successfully navigating this situation.
Yes. And so A, you've got to build it over time, and then B, you've got to address things early, because, and this is where I went wrong with this Cambridge software company, because I hadn't addressed it and wasn't able to address it early, then it became apparent to both sides that there was an issue. And then we both knew, and so then trust went, and then we ended up in a difficult situation. Yeah.
And Rick, how do you think about drawing the line between company performance and CEO performance? Because when the company is not doing well, in some cases, it might be the failure of leadership. And in other cases, underlying business reasons, as you explained with that business that was struggling to make sales, regardless of who the leader is.
Yeah, it's hard. You got to be, like as an investor, as a director, you just have to look at the situation and try and form the best judgment you can as to what the underlying causes are. And sometimes it's obvious, people are complaining about the CEO, there's things that they obviously should be happening that are not. Uh, and other times, as in the case of this software company I described, it's much less obvious. And boards do, I think, sometimes make a mistake of, um, so if you're a board, if you're a director of a company and it's not performing, then there are kind of relatively few levers that you can pull, and changing the CEO is a big one. And so it's easy to want to reach for that, maybe in the hope that it's going to fix things that it won't, right? Because it's like, so a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's a bit like that. I've got kind of one lever, so that looks like it's probably the solution, and it's easy to fall prey to.
Yeah. And also, I imagine, I'm not an investor, but I imagine it's an easy way to feel like you are doing something to address the situation.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
another bias, isn't it? It's like, at
Yeah.
least I'm doing something, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're like me, but I'd rather walk to the next tube station than queue for a long time to get into the one that I'm next to, right?
Mhm.
That's that
Yeah.
same thing.
And Nic, if you think about the founders who are listening to us right now, some of them will be in a situation when they are considering to step down, but maybe they haven't started the conversation with their with their boards yet. What would you like them to know, or what advice would you like to offer them?
So what advice would I like to offer them? So I suppose the first piece is just to really take the time to think clearly through your situation. Find someone that you can talk to. It's really, we had a conversation minutes ago about separating from an investor perspective, separating company performance from individual performance. The same is true for founders, CEOs assessing how things are going. And it's easy to blame yourself when maybe that's not the case. It's easy to feel, particularly, in a situation where you raise money promising that sales are going to grow X% and then they haven't. And so you kind of feel made promises that I'm not now delivering. All of that you need to try to put to one side. And it's like, okay, where is the company today? What's working? What's not? Am I the best person to be running this? Part of the calculus, you might not be doing a perfect job, but I'm going to find anybody else who's going to do a better job is not necessarily the case, even if you're not doing things perfectly. So that's one, try and the situation. And then two, start trying to have the conversation with your board, with your investors as early as you can. You've got to be careful not to scare people. As I was describing earlier, you can start horses running and then that can be counterproductive. So, you've got to meet people where they are. So you've got to make that assessment as well. Are people ready to have the conversation early? And if they are, then be having the conversation early. Uh, if not, then you've just got to kind of hold on for a little bit longer, try and build the trust and get yourself to a place where you can be having the conversation. It's not always easy. Like got one friend now actually so he raised money and then the two people he'd raised money for, the partners at the funds that he'd raised money from, both moved on within a year. And so then he had two people that he hadn't chosen, didn't get on with on his board. And so he never was wanting to have a CEO conversation, but if he had, I'm strongly imagining it would have been difficult at any point, right? So if that's the situation, then you just need to wait till you're sure, and then again try and have it as early as possible. But then you just got to really wait till you're sure.
So starting the conversation early enough, but only once you've got a certain level of confidence that this is
Yeah,
what you want to do.
confidence in either how the conversation is going to go, or if you think it's going to go badly,
Yeah.
then you need to. It just needs to not be a conversation; it's just happening, isn't it?
Yeah. And what would you like to share with the investors who might be listening to us? People with multiple investments and maybe suspecting that some founders in their portfolio might be considering stepping down, or maybe they are thinking that they might initiate this conversation, but nothing has started yet.
Like I feel like I just kind of motherhood and apple pie advice on investing, but it's the things we've talked about, isn't it? It's try to have deep, trusting relationships with your founders, give them space to say when things are going well, when they're not going well, and in small ways as well as kind of the big way of I think I might need to move on from the company, and trying to approach the whole thing from a position of understanding and compassion ultimately. And I think that's how you build trust
Yeah.
and get through these things as best you can.
And when you think about how we as a tech ecosystem, startup ecosystem, can navigate these conversations better going forward. Right now, it feels like it's not an easy conversation to have, neither for founders nor for the investors. What would you like to see changing in the coming years?
So, we've talked about this. We talked about this at the launch event for your book, didn't we? I think the fact that you've written your book and we're having these conversations now gets the conversation out into the open. I think, literally nobody was talking about this before. And hopefully, people reading your book, people listening to the podcasts you're recording, just kind of makes it a little bit easier to be having that first conversation with a trusted third party on the board or with an investor or investors equally thinking, Gorka, I'm not 100% sure about the situation at this company. I'll check in with the founder in a way that maybe they wouldn't otherwise. And, the more that happens, the more it becomes normalized and the stronger we'll all be.
So either way, we're not talking about it too much as a startup ecosystem in general, but these conversations can become easier if they are normalized, if more people talk about it and it stops being such a taboo topic that everyone is only comfortable discussing in private.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And on the flip side and this is maybe something to think about from the VC perspective. So if it was a case here at Molten that when one of our CEOs came and said, I want to leave the company, and we're like, well, why didn't we know about that? Has anyone been talking to them for a year or more, right? And if that's a surprise, then, well, you're asking the investment manager, why is that a surprise? Like, well, because the default should be that we're having the conversation such that we can see these things coming. And that's better for the company, better for our investment, better way of practicing venture ultimately.
Yeah. So again, avoiding an abrupt conversation and building enough trust to start discussing it much, much earlier than the transition actually happens.
And the mantra we have across many aspects of venture is like, we just don't want surprises. I mean, we get them a lot because things happen in the startup world, but the fewer surprises you get, the better.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of maybe a number one piece of advice that the founder CEOs hear about board management. Never surprise the board. It definitely served me well when I was the CEO of Makers. I'm sure I sometimes surprised the board, but at least I tried to deliver all the unexpected pieces of information in between board meetings, so that at the board everyone was ready.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way to do things.
Yeah, Nic, as we're preparing to start wrapping up our conversation today, is there anything else you would like to share on this topic?
I think we've been around, haven't we? I think we've covered most of it, Evgeny. Yeah. I just finished by saying, thank you for having me on this podcast. Thank you for writing your book. Thank you for founding Makers. Thank you for many things. It's been good.
Yeah. Thank you too. And thank you in particular for playing your part in making sure that our CEO transition at Makers was a success. I think now, 4 years later, it's I think by now we've got the benefit of hindsight to say that we've done a good job there.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Amazing. All right. Thanks, Evgeny. Take care.
To wrap up our conversation, I would like to highlight a few points. The most important one is the importance of trust. With the benefit of hindsight, the reason we navigated our own transition at Makers 4 years ago so well is that there was a really good amount of trust on both sides. Nic and I have known each other for many, many years, and this definitely helped us navigate this situation. The example that Nic gave about that company in Cambridge, where there was a breakdown of trust, and as the result, everyone had to navigate quite a confrontational situation, was clearly more difficult. And if possible, this should be avoided. So investing in building relationships over the years and talking about company performance and CEO performance way before it comes to CEO succession can make a really big difference. And here it can be important to differentiate between company performance and CEO performance, because sometimes it can be easy to say, okay, things are not going well, let's replace the CEO, but it's a very big lever to pull. It's a very risky move. As Nic said, maybe only about 50-60% of new CEOs actually work out. And the problem might actually be elsewhere. If there is a fundamental problem with the business model or some other aspect of the business, changing the CEO might not necessarily fix the problem. And so it's important to really analyze and pinpoint the problem, making sure that if the CEO needs to be changed, it's the right thing to do. And this analysis has to be done both by the CEO themselves and by the board. And here, a trusted conduit who can broker the conversation, like a chair, for example, can really make a difference. I hope you found this conversation interesting and useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe on the platform of your choice, and speak to you soon.